In this course, I'm covering architectural renderings in Rhino 8 with D5 render. I'm also going to go into the history of architectural renderings, not a long history, actually a very, very brief history lesson on architectural renderings, and just understanding important principles with regard to architectural renderings. So I'm definitely going to cover a how-to of how to create renderings like this, and how to take something from Rhino that looks like this and output it like this on D5 render. And we'll do other views, and show you material settings with polycarbonate and with wood, metals, landscaping. So we're going to cover how to do all of these things. But the first thing I actually want to cover is the history of architectural renderings, a very, very, very brief history of architectural renderings, and this idea of realism in architectural rendering and what it actually means. So the first thing that I'm going to do is just show you some quick art that's quite inspirational. So typically, a lot of people use this term realism in architecture. Let me show you how to create a realistic rendering. This is a tutorial for a realistic rendering. I think this term realism is a little problematic because it's a very subjective term that means a lot of things to different people. And so, for example, if we're looking at this, this is an artwork from the 1600s by Michael Snyders, and it's a study of human anatomy, specifically human facial anatomy with eyes, right? Someone can look at this and say this is a realistic portrayal of the human eye, right? It's an accurate portrayal of the human eye. And then you can look at artwork like this, right, by Jono Dry. Jono Dry actually has a YouTube channel, but I just want to scroll up, give him credit. This is his artwork. He does this by hand. Like he does this with graphite and pencil, if I'm not mistaken. This is also realistic. This is what you would call hyper-realistic, where you're going into extreme detail of showing, skin texture, reflectivity of the eye, even the moisture of the actual eye anatomy, the pores of the skin, the hair follicles. And so someone, again, can say this is realistic, and someone can say this is realistic. And it's the same thing in rendering. You have renderers who can, on any render software, can create realistic renderings that have the same realistic qualities like what you see in this drawing by Jono Dry, right? And then you also have people who can do renderings like this that can say that's also realistic. So you need to know what you are aiming for in your rendering style and what you're presenting as realistic, right? I would say in a studio setting and maybe in a conceptual architectural competition setting, realism is, in my opinion, this is just my opinion, realism isn't really the priority in conveying architectural renderings. It's the priority, I would say, is conveying a narrative or a story in your architectural rendering. And it's more so about creating a sense of drama. And if you want things, obviously, to have a sense of realism, go for it. But typically, if you look at any major architecture competition in the past 10 years and you look at the renderings, a lot of the renderings are actually quite dramatic. And a lot of the lightings are actually not accurate. And so I think that's okay. That's totally okay at a conceptual level, at definitely an academic level, at a competition level. And I think that's what I tend to render at, and what I prefer to render at is more of like a dramatic, narrative-driven rendering. I think when you go to a professional setting, that's when you have to be careful. That's when you actually have to be accurate with what you show your client, right? You don't want to give your client a false impression. You don't want to show your client how a rendering renders, or excuse me, how a material renders, but then the actual product looks completely different. Whether it's the scale of the material, the size of the material, the pattern, the color, the texture, you want to be accurate. It doesn't mean it has to be realistic. But even at the professional level and at the schematic level, you want to show them things that are thought-provoking and narrative-based and story-based tied to your concept. At the same time, you want to be primarily and I would say majority accurate in your portrayal or depiction of your concept. And so what I want to do is I want to show you three architectural painters that, in my opinion, I would say are like the OG architectural renderers. There are three Dutch painters that were doing a lot of architectural paintings in what people would call as the Dutch Golden Age. And even like I would say the European Golden Age to a certain degree. I mean, there was some conflict with the Protestant Reformation and colonization, but typically the 1600s in Europe was like a flourishing of arts and scientific research. There were still, many wars, and it was kind of at the end of some of the major wars that were happening, like religious wars. But other than that, specifically in the Netherlands, and the Dutch had a lot of amazing artwork coming out in the 1600s and mid 1600s. That was Rembrandt's period. But at that period, you also had amazing architectural painters that were kind of diverging from typical architectural depictions from before. The architectural drawings from before were typically had like a symbology to it, whether it was symbolizing some type of religious theme or a political theme or about the certain political context, regional context. These three Dutch painters I'm going to show you kind of paved the way of showing architecture for the sake of architecture. I'm pretty sure that their work had symbology behind it, but I just want to analyze it from like an architectural standpoint. And the first Dutch painter that I want to talk about is Pieter Jansz Saenredam. I'm probably going to pronounce his name incorrectly, but people think Saenredam, I kind of have this opinion as well, is that he's like the father of like architectural rendering and architectural painting, of showing just like architectural interiors in like just for the sake of architecture. And I'm going to show you like a progression because he has a disciple and then he has other people that were contemporaries. But if you look at this architectural painting, it's quite dramatic. That's number one. There's a lot of drama, right? Another thing that's really important to take into consideration is the lighting. The lighting is actually inaccurate. The lighting is embellished. And I'm going to show you the differences. The lighting's actually not 100% accurate. And so that's why I go back to this idea of realism versus narrative, right? Where you maybe want to show and convey a certain idea at the sake of maybe taking away from the realism or accuracy. I'm not sure if many people have been inside, grand churches or cathedrals, but they're actually quite dark. And that's the whole point. Like, there's a huge contrast of light and shadow in cathedrals. There's this, there is like a spiritual feeling, as is in any religious temple, where there is this huge play of shadow and light. And as you can tell here, even the ambient light here is very well lit, which isn't really accurate when you look at true, church interiors from the 1500s, 1600s. It's actually quite dark, and there's this like mysterious play of light and shadow. But even if you look at the ambient light is very well lit, which isn't accurate. But honestly, it's okay, because the point of the drawing is to convey the space, the scale, the texture, the perspective. And that's the third point that I want to bring up, is the perspective, right? So like if this is right here, human eye level, right? If this is human eye level, you're not looking straight ahead. You're not looking straight ahead. You're actually looking up. So like if we were looking at elevation, right? If this is a person, right? If this is a person standing and that's the ground, people typically aren't looking straight ahead like a robot. People are looking up, they're looking down, they're looking to the side, right? And so this is like the perspective of someone who's standing in space and admiring the space. They're like kind of an awe. So he's really emphasizing the vault, the vault of the nave and the texture of the vaults, the color of the vaults, the rhythm, the repetition, right? Even this, like, look at this. Like, if someone was looking straight ahead, even in peripheral vision, at best, this is going to be cut off from your peripheral vision, or it's going to be blurred completely. Same thing here, like same thing here, right? Like, your eye is really probably going to see this much if you're standing this far back. But this rendering, or excuse me, this drawing, this painting is as if someone is standing and looking up. And that's the whole point of these drawings, and that's why these drawings were quite novel, was because they were really just showing the architecture. They're showing off the architecture, and you can actually really notice this, because look how small the people are. Like, the people aren't even emphasized. The people are at best secondary, if anything at all, right? And then the fourth thing is like this play of middle ground, foreground, and background. Like, there's this strong element in the foreground, right? That's right there in front of you, and then you have a quite neutral middle ground and a very strong background that is really pulling your eye in with the perspective. So again, these drawings are really about drama, about creating drama. It's not really about creating like hyper realistic depictions of the space, even though obviously like the majority of the space is depicted accurately, but it's embellished. So this is one example. And again, this is by Saenredam. Saenredam is like the OG person. Another, his student, I think his name is Van Vliet. These are all Dutch. The Van Vliet, Hendrick Cornelis Van Vliet. His work is just absolutely beautiful. It's like almost tangible. It's like you can touch it. It's almost like coming to life. If you look at his work, and I'm going to show you Emanuel de Witte. Witte's work is a great comparison to this. This work is actually, I would say, a quite accurate representation of lighting in a church interior, because even when you look at the ambient lighting in here, it's not like crazy well lit. Like, the contrast of the ambient and the direct light is quite accurate in my opinion. So what I mean by this is, like, if you look at the backside of the column, right, and you see the ambient light, and the same thing here, the ambient light here, right, because the direct light is coming from here, the contrast between the direct light, right, and the ambient light is very subtle. Like, everything is kind of even toned with the lighting. The people are even toned, the ground is even toned, the lighting, everything is even toned. But it's still dramatic. It's just dramatic in a different, it's dramatic in a very subtle, soft, almost like dreamlike way. And what I love about this, again, which is really important, is like looking at the play of foreground, middle ground, and background, right? Like, look, like you have, like, I love, like, look how like dramatic this is. It's so cool, like with the curtain in the foreground and this little archway, which is like completely contrasting from what you're actually seeing. But it's playing with this like a strong play of foreground, like something that's literally in your face at the foreground, right? And then the middle ground is typically this very, strong emphasis of the architecture, and the background kind of just bleeds away, where you don't really notice the background as much. Okay, and so again, this is very dramatic. I would say though that like this is a great example of like an accurate depiction of the lighting. But again, I would say all three that I'm going to show you, they are embellishing the interiors. Now, the third one is Emanuel de Witte. Witte, he had quite a flamboyant life. I mean, I'm not sure if people know Caravaggio. Caravaggio was just like a complete troublemaker. He had beautiful artwork, but Caravaggio's like personal life was just completely chaotic. Emanuel de Witte is the same thing. He had like a very chaotic lifestyle. But if you look at his work, I want to just show you the comparison. This is like a total exaggeration of lighting in a cathedral, in a church. It's it's completely exaggerated. Like, and this is like, look at this, right? Look at the lighting here. Look how like everything is like bumped up. The lighting's all bumped up, and compare it back to Van Vliet. Right, so let your eye dwell on Van Vliet for like 2 seconds or 5 seconds. It's soft, it's subtle. The lighting is all muted. It's just incredibly subtle and soft. Now look, get ready. Like, it's just it's like very lit. Like, everything, it's like if you took this to Photoshop and you used the brightness adjustment layer, or if you used the like the levels adjustment layer and you kind of punched the highlights or the neutrals, like the neutral tones, that's basically what's happening here. Like, just look at how bright the direct light is, but then look at how bright the indirect light is. Like, everything is like super lit, you know? And that's not accurate in a like specific cathedral setting. You know, like how is the ambient light this bright, you know? And so, but again, does it matter? Like, does it actually matter in like the narrative? No, it doesn't. You know, it's really about conveying the space, the quality, and again, this is really about the architecture, because if you look at the people, right? Look how dark the people are. You barely even notice the people, like even on the pulpit. Like, so, you know, light is coming in this way, but he doesn't even light, you know, the person on the pulpit, right? Like, he's not even lit. It's just like it's like tertiary. But however, again, going back to this idea of like strong foreground, this character here is very well lit. This character is actually part of the architecture, right? Like, look, you see how he's lit right here? No one else is lit like him, right? So he's getting the lighting. Let me just clear the annotations. But like, you see, he's getting lit here, and he's really right there in the foreground. And the middle ground, obviously, is the architecture. So I just really want to show this, that even people back then, you know, as much as because this was a time period of really exploring art and perspective and colors and textures and paintings, they really wanted to tell the story. They really wanted to emphasize story and narrative. And so I think it's so important to carry that concept when you do architectural renderings. So let me just quickly you know, so you have something like this, something like that. Like, look how dark this is compared to other ones. Again, I would say this is like quite accurate, very accurate with lighting. And then, you know, something like this, right? Again, you see how like bright, like it's like you increase the brightness on Photoshop or something, you know, or you bump the highlights on Photoshop. But again, they're all dramatic, and that's the rendering styles I like to do. You know, I like to do like dramatic. But you know, when I meet my clients, like, I definitely show them accurate representations. I don't want to give them a false impression of what they think they're going to get. You know, that's the worst position you want to be in, is show them something that they're not going to get in a rendering. So again, I think dramatic renderings are fantastic for architecture studios, like at an academic level. Like, just go all out. Don't worry about being super accurate. Just make it super dramatic, especially for like a design-focused architecture curriculum, and for like architecture competitions. Because architecture competitions are really about concept, about big idea concepts, not about the fine details of, you know, materials. And even it is about materials, you're gonna show the material like in a very customized way, you know? I'm gonna now transition over to Rhino, and I'm gonna show you again how to, you know, create, you know, how we can take something like this and make it like this on Rhino and on D5 render. Okay, so here we are in Rhino. I'm gonna show you my Rhino workflow with D5 render. I wanna emphasize something. If you are an architect or even an architecture student, architectural rendering is only one aspect of what you're working on. So your time is very precious with where you place your effort in creating renderings, plans, diagrams, sections, elevations. You have such a limited amount of time. If you're an architecture student, you also have other courses you have to take. And I think the issue is that people teach architectural renderings as if like you are only an architectural renderer. And no, you have other things to do, right? And same thing like in a professional setting. You have other things to do. And architectural rendering is just one aspect of it. And so I want to try to show you a way that's like as efficient as possible, where you can cut a lot of corners, but still convey dramatic renderings, okay? So the number one thing is that you need to be very organized in your Rhino model, okay? Or in any 3D model. You just need to be very organized with how you organize your materials, how you organize your layers, okay? So I'm very serious with how I layer my things, because it's gonna help you in D5 render or in any program. It doesn't even have to be D5. It can be any rendering program you use. You need to be unapologetically organized, extremely organized in your layering protocol. It's going to make your life much easier, and just make you a better 3D modeler, you know? So this is just a very basic model of just, you know, a gabled shed with deck steps and like this extended gutter system. Another important thing I want to point out is I am using my own materials. I like to use my own materials. It's not like there's anything wrong with any of the rendering software's materials, but I like to have a lot of control in the materials that I use. And so the materials I use are actually very simple. I'm using just simple 2D textures right here. Let me just show you. Right, I'm literally using just like regular textures. So like for my wood, I'm just using this texture right here, right? I'm literally just using this texture for my wood, and I'm using this texture for my gravel. And then I'm using polycarbonate. I literally just took an image of polycarbonate. Let me try to find it. This is what I'm using for my polycarbonate material. That's it. I'm only using like 3 or 4 materials. And I want to show you something else that's really helpful. If you want to create maps like displacement maps or bump maps, you can do it in Photoshop. Photoshop now has like these filters, but there is a really cool website. I want to give it credit because it's awesome. If you go here, this is the website. It's Normal Map Online. This is the website right here. You can create normal maps, displacement maps, ambient occlusion maps, specular maps if you want to on here. Like for example, I can click on displacement, right? And I can click here, right? And then I can just, upload anything. Like I can upload like this image, right? Right? And so it automatically creates a displacement map for me. I can also automatically create a bump, a normal map for me. You see? And so if I click download, it'll just download this map right here for me. If I do all, it's going to download the normal, displacement, ambient, and specular. And you can even play with the intensity and the strength, So you see here, like this is showing you a preview of it, right? And so like you can play around with it. You see, so it's super flat. You can bump it up if you wanted to. You see, and it'll edit it right away. And it's for free. So I just want to really give credit to this person. I think this is his name right here, Petri Christian. But it's awesome, and it's very helpful. So this is something to pay attention to. This is what I like to use if I need to create displacement maps or normal maps. A lot of the rendering software does that for you as well. Number 2 is mapping and the material. So like for my wood facade, right? My wood facade, I actually went ahead and I modeled it physically. You don't have to do that, but I do that because I like to make the things that are being conveyed in my design detailed. Not everything. So like, for example, if you see here, like I modeled this part, but this backside, I didn't do anything to it because you're not going to see in the rendering, right? So, but the wood facade, for example, or any facade element is probably like important. And so you want to make sure it's shown in a certain level of detail that you're not scared to go up close and show the rendering, right? So that's an important thing. So you see, I even chamfered the corner so you kind of get like this depth in there. The same thing with like the wood decking. You see? Same thing with the wood decking. Right here, I really don't, whatever. This is, no one's ever going to see this, right? And this is the polycarbonate. So I'm going to switch to rendered view real fast. Right, so in rendered view, so I like to have all of my materials in Rhino. I like to assign all my materials in Rhino. I'll edit it and tweak it in D5, but as a base, I like to keep the base materials in Rhino just because if I want to go back and show things in a different viewport, I have my materials with me. So when it comes to mapping, mapping is super important, right? So for example, when I click on this object here, I go here and I go to my texture mapping, right? I typically will box map this entire group right here. I'll box map it. And then sometimes I'll change the repetition to make it more dense. So like, for example, you see right here, this is the same patterning at just 1. Like, so this is the original texture map at 1. If I double it up in the X direction, you see how it just gets more dense now? Just way more dense. You see? It's hard to tell, but if I zoom in, it got tighter. right? I can go down and make it even, let me just show you again. So it's at 2, the x direction is at 2. Make it 3, so you see it's repeating it more and more. Now it's getting way too repetitive. Back to 1. So you see how the grain is kind of wide, right? Maybe like 1.5. So it's really up to you how detailed you want to be. So this is like 6-inch wide. There's like 6-inch wide planks. You can also adjust the size of it, but I'm just doing it through the repetition. And the same thing here with the sizing. So texture mapping is really important. You want to make sure, and that's why rendered view is important. You can also texture map in D5, but I just like to do the texture mapping on Rhino for myself. It gives me way more control. You see? And then the same thing for the polycarb. If I click on the polycarb right here, you can give it a surface map and give it a UV. So right now this is just a surface, right? Because it's just a single surface. And you see here, I'm playing around with the texture maps. It's at 0.5. It's kind of wide, making it very wide. So make sure when you texture map, so if it's typically a solid, like a rectangular solid, you would typically want to do your box mapping. You know, if it's curved, you want to do your cylindrical mapping. You can do cylindrical mapping, or you can do spherical mapping if it's curved. If it's planar, you can just do the typical default, or you can do the surface mapping. And I do all defaults, right? So for example, if I click here, right, let me just get rid of the texture map, and let me just remap it. So I just select the defaults. Bounding box will do the entire default size of the selected geometry. You press enter. You can do the coordinate system, like do you want it to be C-plane or world? You can select default, or you can do world. And then capped means, do you want to also texture map like the top portion of the material as well, you know? And so I typically do yes, right? So there you go. So again, this is basically taking that one image. It's taking this, it's basically taking this image right here, right? And it's spreading it across the entire rendering. And just to show you how to add the material on here, right? I just go facade wood, dark wood. You know, I don't even do anything on here. I make, you know, a custom material, right? I do a custom material, right? And then I go down, right? And I just I go here and I add the file. That's all I do. That's all I do. I can add the bumps and normals, but you can also do it in D5, which I'll show you. But see, that's it. That's all I do in Rhino. What I also do in Rhino is I create views. So if I type in named view, right, I create like preliminary views just to, you know, orient me on D5. Okay, so here we are in D5 render. All I did was I opened up D5 render, and I opened up the Rhino file in D5 render separately, and I saved this file, right, separately. I did file save as. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into Rhino. I'm going to I'm going to sync and, you know, connect D5 render, and I'm going to sync it, right? And then I'm going to synchronize the scene list, okay? Because right now it doesn't have the scenes. I'm going to synchronize scene list, right? So now, you know, sync success. If I go back to here, so you see now I have all these 3 views here. You see? I have view 1, view 2, view 5. I want to rename this like a V4 or something later on, right? So we have these views here. Now, if we look at these materials here, so like I can adjust these materials even more, right? So like for example, the polycarb, I can adjust that. So if I, you know, click, I like to click on the eyedropper and then click here on the material. So if you're, you know, organized with your materials, D5 is going to organize your materials for you based on your model's material attributes. So like when I click on this, it's going to click on all of the materials that have the same settings, right? Or it's going to click on all the objects that have these materials. So when I click on this, it's selecting everything that has polycarbonate. If I click on like the wood, it's going to select everything that has this wood material in Rhino. So it doesn't select the polycarb. So I want to select here, right? So polycarb, I want to do a couple things, right? So like I can go here and I can change it to like a transparent material, right? That's number one. I mean, so polycarb typically doesn't look like this. Polycarb is quite opaque. I mean, you have transparent polycarb, but I don't want it to look like that, right? So I want it to have an opacity to it. I always have caustics on. And the roughness is the reflectivity, right? Like how clear the reflection is of your material, right? So if I increase the specular, which is how much it reflects, right? So specular one means like 100% reflection. It will reflect everything. Roughness is how clear is the reflection, right? And then the opacity, is, let me just go here. We'll go test it like this for now, right? And so you see, we'll come back and play around with this, but the roughness of polycarb, it's not a mirror. It's not a mirror like that, right? It's kind of, it kind of blurs your reflection. So you kind of want to fine tune it and do it with eyeball. So that's quite clear. So maybe like 0.1, 0.2, that's where you kind of want to be, right? And then you can give it a thickness, if you wanted to. In this scenario, it's not going to make that huge of a difference. And you see here with the UV, you can actually change the UV settings. Like I can go in here and make this like wider. You see how it just, you see that? It made it, it increased the UV settings by the X and the Y because it's linked. You can unlink it and change it separately if you wanted to, right? But see, that's my polycarb here. And, if you want to go back and change it, we can go back and change it more. Like if you want it to be more rough, right? So it's like less image based, like it's not reflecting the image as much. You can do that. You're going to come back and adjust this a little bit more. I'm quite happy with this. I would say I would have changed the texture mapping of this wood in Rhino because you see how it kind of like folds and matches, like it book matches. But you're going to see with the lighting settings what I'll do. So once, I mean, this is like one of the major adjustments that I just really want to fix on the polycarb. Maybe I might, let me see, the base color is fine because polycarb typically is white. You can get like different colors. Now, the next thing that I want to do on here is look at the gravel, right? So on the gravel, if I click on gravel, I can go again in custom and I can do displacement if I wanted to, right? And remember that website I showed you? Like I can upload the normals on here if I wanted to. I go to downloads, like I can upload the normal map on here, right? And I can also upload the displacement map, which is the height, on here. So it's really your choice what you want to do with regard to the displacement, right? So if I zoom in on here, right, I can start to play around with the height maps. It just matters how it looks depending on your view. And if you right click, it'll always go to default. Same thing with your normal. You see? If you're going to use a normal map, you typically don't want to play around with your height map. Like it's one or the other. You don't need to do both. But I'm just showing you both settings right now. And then again, the texture, like we can make it a little bit more fine. Like that. Now, the next thing that's really important is your landscaping. This is what's going to make or break the rendering. Is for exterior renderings, is your landscaping or your environment and your lighting. These two things are so important. And to be honest, if you're not taking advantage of lighting and shadows, you shouldn't even be using this software. The whole purpose of this software, yes, they show materials quite well, but the reason why these softwares excel and other rendering softwares, whether it's Lumion or Enscape, is because of their lighting and how they calculate lighting. And if you're not going to take advantage of showing the lighting, which is, in my opinion, fantastic. Even on D5, I would say D5 is probably so far like one of the best in showing lighting and how it depicts lighting. Then you're kind of cutting yourself short. And then the same thing with landscaping. And so going back to the idea of those Dutch painters, we're really going to use landscaping as like this like foreground element, right? And so if I can go here and I can go on the brush tool, for example. And if I go to nature, like I want to use, maybe a material like this. Like I want to use a lot of like tall ground cover, and like I want it to be very diverse in type. So I might use these. Let me see. I might want to use something. And also I can go here and I can filter it, right? I can do like flowering shrub. Maybe I'm using this, using that, using this, right? And then here, I definitely want a large variety. So I want it dense, and I definitely want there to be like just random size. And I typically align it to terrain, but this is a flat terrain. And then the radius, if you see here, like what I typically like to do is I like to go to top view when I do this, right? I like to go to top view. I just press T, or you can go to your camera and you can do top, right? And I make this quite big. I might fast forward through this because it's going to slow down my computer because I'm like on super high settings right now and I'm recording this. So I might just fast forward through here. But I literally just, go and I paint like a huge circle around this whole area. Right? So you see? Just it's quite random, to be honest. Right? I first paint like a much bigger one like this. And then I will go in and I will make the radius smaller. And then I paint the inside. Let me go ahead and make it even smaller than that, just so I have a little bit more control. And then I'll go in and I'll start to paint closer into here. You know? Like this, all in top view because it's just easier. And then what I'll do actually is I will like go into my eraser tool. I will use my eraser tool down here, or up here, excuse me. This is my eraser, right? And you can start to like carve paths in here. Cut, like erase through here or something. This is really slow because I'm recording, but I'll probably transition the video and show you this after I kind of cut and clean things a little bit, But like I kind of want to cut through and like make a path so that it'll help me when I create an actual view. Okay, I'm going to transition this video and show you the actual scene, like the actual, I'm just gonna clean this up. So I'm gonna fast forward and just clean this up, but it's basically me, I'm just gonna erase some things, maybe add some more brushes, And so typically like I wanna toggle back and forth, right? So like I wanna go to view 2, for example, you see? And like, oh, like I need, way more landscaping here, for example, right? So I'll go back up with the top view. I'll go back in the top view and I'll paint more, right? Over here. I'll paint more over here. So if I go back to view 2, I'll also see how like, how does the polycarb feel with the reflection? Do I like how it reflects, and go through the times of day to see how the polycarb is looking, you know? And if if I'm not liking it, I can just go here and click on this again and see, okay, maybe I like how the polycarb looks, or I want it to be a little bit more rough, like that maybe, so if it doesn't seem so like metal-like or glass-like. So you're going to do like this back and forth. But basically for landscaping, and you see how tall the landscaping is? That's actually intentional. I want my landscaping to be dramatic. But yeah, so I'm going to go in and back onto top view, and I'm going to add more plant life closer to the architecture. I'm going to go back and set my views, and so I'm going to transition and show you kind of like the final landscaping product. Okay, so I went ahead and I adjusted some views, right? And I added some trees. I added a tree here, and I added a tree here, and I actually added a 2D, basically like a 2D background. So if you go into assets, right, and you go into model, and if you scroll down, they have backdrop plane, right? I just did autumn trees too. So if you can just click on the backdrop plane autumn trees too, and then it'll come in as a plane. I just because I'm worried it might take up like so much memory. You see that's it's that right there, right? And you can drag it down wherever you like. You can scale it up if you wanted to over here. You can use the V, or you can just scale it up to make it look bigger, right? So that's what I did for both sides. So if I go to top view real fast, I just want to show you what's going on. So you see top view, like I kind of erased a lot of things here, I erased this path. Let me zoom in. I erased I carried like a path here. I erased a lot of stuff here. So that's basically how I brushed it, to create like this splotchiness. You see, so I have a plane here, and I have a plane here, the backdrop plane. That's all. I put two backdrop planes here and here. I think this is two. I think I actually combined two. And because we're looking like this way, and we're looking this way. So I kind of want to capture, these zones here. Now, with regard to views, like I mentioned, the Rhino views was a starting point, right? The Rhino views, and so then I kind of go in and I adjust my views. And the way I'm adjusting my views is I am really using the landscape to frame. So this idea of foreground, like I'm using it to frame right here. And I'm using this to frame right here. And I'm using, you see this here, even this little plant life is intentional. I want to have like a foreground of plant life coming in. And then the middle ground is the architecture. So I'm trying to create frames here, And the people, like I'm using them, I don't want them to be distracting. Okay? I'll show you again for this one as well, this view here. You see, like I'm using this as like a frame. And you see, I have this intentional. Some people may not like this, but I'm intentionally doing this. I'm intentionally, I want the landscape kind of in the eye, And then person in the background, not too distracting. And very subtle sky. The sky's very subtle. And the trees, you see the trees in the back, they're kind of blown out. And then this view here as well. You see, I have the tree. I have this in the foreground, intentional. It's my opinion. I just like having this type of, I guess, setting where you have always something in the foreground. And then tree here. I mean, this is kind of problematic where it's like kind of looks like it's connecting with the tree, but it's okay. It's not a big deal. Again, what I should have done in my material textures, like you see how this almost looks like it's book folded, right? I don't, it's not, I shouldn't have done that. Like I should have changed the texture map of this in the box mapping in Rhino. Remember, I probably should have made it like a repetition of 2. So it's a little bit more dense. But in general, so, These are your settings. So like that's how I really capture my views. Like I try to make the views as dramatic as possible. I want to go for drama here. So I'm gonna have things in the foreground, things on the side framing the view. It's not just the architecture. If you notice, the architecture is kind of to the side, right? So this is kind of centered, but like the architecture here, I have it to the side, right? Architecture's to the side here. Architecture is like to the side here. Okay. And now, and also for like the focus, I have things in focus. Like I use the actual focus right here, right? The depth of field, and I set my focus. And you need to play careful with the blur because the blur can get very extreme. I either go between 1.5 and 5. That's my blur settings. Now, it's really important to deal with lighting settings. This is what because the lighting is kind of, after the landscaping texture, it's how do you adjust the lighting to make it dramatic, okay? And so right now I'm doing a custom sun, all right? I'm doing a custom sun. I want to show you how it looks like when it's not custom, all right? You see, you see the difference? It's like a huge difference, okay? Like even if let's say like I'm doing 0 here, like that's not bad. Like the wood texture looks great here, right? If you really want to show off the wood texture, you see the wood texture looks great. But like, do you see how when you do the depth, like that little 45-degree cut in the Rhino model, it gives it like a nice, even same thing up here, right? So it's not bad. We can play with the lighting to try to get shadow on here. That's not bad either, right? It's okay. What I'm aiming for is I'm trying to get shadow and lighting. I'm trying to get contrast of shadow and lighting, highlights and midtones and dark tones, okay? That's what I'm trying to get here. So I kind of want to like highlight the gravel, the texture of the gravel. I want to highlight the texture of the wood on the decking wood. I want to highlight the texture of the facade wood as well. But I want there to be a play of shadow and light. And so sometimes you can get it by playing around with the sun settings. And so this is where this idea of like accuracy comes into play versus being where you're like exaggerating the lighting. So again, going back to that Dutch painting examples, sometimes they exaggerated the lighting, right? So I'm going to show you an example where the lighting is accurate. Right now, like, if you're in the northern hemisphere, this is probably going to be quite accurate lighting depending where in the northern hemisphere because it's doing a north offset, right? And it's basically following the altitude, following the altitude of like the northern hemisphere lighting, right? So like, this is sunrise, sunset. You just want to make sure that your lighting, your model is located in the correct northern position. But like, depending on the lighting, it just doesn't look good with like the material textures may not look good depending on the lighting. So like I want to pick a lighting that really starts to show off the shadows and the lighting, like the actual like direct light and shadows. I mean, that's the whole point of using this program to begin with. And I want it to be dramatic. And so sometimes you can get away with it by, so something like this isn't bad, right? You see, this isn't bad, like, because you're getting, highlights here of the gravel. You're getting shadow here as well. And you're getting kind of the shadow here. So it's kind of like tying everything together, right? And that's the whole point of the lighting and the shadow. When you get like shadows and lighting hitting off the architecture, it's tying everything in as one element. I was like, it's part of the context. That's why I like to show like lighting and shadow and the play of the two, because it really ties the entire design with the context. Doesn't make it feel like a little object floating in space. So you can, this is fine. Like this isn't bad, So you can take a shot like this. This is like super blown out, right? But then you see that the material doesn't look that great. It looks way too repetitive here, which I can adjust, but I don't want to. I don't want to adjust that. I just want to leave it alone. I don't want to keep adjusting material. Same thing here. I mean, this isn't like really accurately shown. Like the edge condition is not really going to look like that. But again, no one's really going to pay attention to this. At like schematic level, at competition level, at architecture studio level. Like these things are so in the weeds. Like you're trying to aim for storytelling, not like super. You can do that later on. Like for this, you want to really tell the story of the project, right? So I like how the shadows are playing here, but I just feel like it's missing, more dramatic lighting. Okay, so just a quick recap on like lighting. So you have basically the altitude and the azimuth, right? So if this was like a circular plane and this is the sun, right, and the sun rises and sets, right? So like this, let's say this is the sun right here, right? This angle, right, is the altitude angle, right? And then if this is the north offset and this is 0 degrees, right, and this is 90 and this is 180, right? So like 60 is over here, right? The sun typically rises in depending on the season around 60 degrees in the azimuth angle, right? But the altitude is really low. Altitude is probably like, I don't know, like 18 degrees or something. Okay, so the north offset, what that's saying is like what's the angle of the north offset from here? Okay, that's what it's saying. So depending which region of the world you're in, the north offset is going to be slightly different depending on the time of the day and the season. So you can be like super accurate with that and be like, I'm in so and so region, and at 5:30 p.m. In the afternoon, the azimuth is like maybe it's pretty high in the sky, right? Because 5:36 is like almost, we'll go like around 3. You're probably around like 75 degrees, right? That's pretty accurate in like these after in like summer afternoon. But see, it doesn't look nice. It just doesn't look good. Like it looks, like the material looks flat. Everything looks flat. Looks very harsh. So if I can't get the renderings or the lighting I like from the default, I will embellish the lighting. Okay, it's like a friendly way. I will embellish the lighting. I think this one wasn't bad though. The one that we had, like this one is actually not bad. This is actually pretty good in my opinion. I just don't like how this looks. But I want to show you how we can make this like way more dramatic with the lighting, okay? So that requires you to do a custom sun. And I just need to emphasize, like, this is best for academic studio level and like competition studio level where like you're really trying to show the story of the project, and the lighting doesn't need to be like super accurate. It's just to show off the architecture. If you're going to show a client this like in, DD level, you need to be very accurate, and you don't want to lie to your client like this is the lighting condition, right? If you're talking to a client, you want to show your client like accurate representation. So definitely DD level. I mean, schematic level, if you're showing them like rendering options or design options, it's I think okay to still kind of embellish the idea just to sell the idea. But once you're actually like doing an option, you want to be very honest of how things look. So again, the custom sun I would say is great to do when you're in concept, academic, competition level. So altitude like 19.8, that means the sun is like really low off the ground, right? So when the sun is like really low off the ground, that means the shadows are gonna be like really dramatic. The shadows will be super dramatic and like super long. Okay, so that's number one. So the altitude is at 19.8. Azimuth, so that's like basically sunset, right? So again, if we have a circle, right, and this is 0 degrees, and this is 90, and then this is 180, right, and this is 270, what this is saying is that the sun is literally, right here. It's almost about to set, okay? So that's what that means right there. And we can play around with we can play around with the lighting angle if we want to. So you see that's basically sunset. So 19.8. So you see how you're getting that shadow right there, right? 261. So you see what's happening here? You're getting shadow right here, right? You're getting this contrast of highlights, right? Highlights, shadow, shadow, highlights. So you can't really tell the repetition of the material anymore. You really can't really tell the edge condition, but you can really read the texture of the material. You can read the depth of the material, right? You can read the gravel, right? So I think this is fantastic. You could technically say this is lighting. This is like, close to like very like sunset lighting. This is typically like golden hour, what you would say, or almost golden hour. What I also like to do is in my settings here, when I go to effect, I really want this to be quite warm. So like my highlight exposure. So if this is on 0, right? You see if it's on 0, it's going to really punch the highlights. So when you increase the highlight exposure, it actually brings down the highlights. So, you want to kind of be careful with it. Like it kind of washes this out. So you want to play around with that and see what you like. I kind of like my rents to be a little bit washed out. And then the same thing with your shadow local exposure. It's the opposite. It'll actually bring down your shadows. Okay. So if I go here, like you see, or if I bring it up, you see how lighter the shadow got for shadow local exposure. So if I make it 0 as a default, it's quite dark, right? And then contrast, you know what contrast is. Like I like to punch the contrast a little bit. And the exposure, so if you notice, I don't do auto exposure. I like to control my exposure myself. So you see, I just like to punch it just a little bit, not too much, okay? And then for color temperature, like you notice, I have it actually quite warm. If I right click on here, like, do you see how cool it is at the default at 6500? I want it actually quite warm. And I might take it to Photoshop to make it a little bit warmer. But that's that. And then bloom, people need to be careful with bloom. People go a little bit intense with bloom. I think, if you see a lot of renderings for competitions, it's like all bloomed out. Looks like you're going to heaven or something. So take it easy on the bloom. But the bloom basically makes anything that's highlight, it highlights the highlights even more with like this like gloss, like almost like a Gaussian blur kind of effect. So play around with it with your liking. But if you notice here, like this is very dramatic lighting compared to the default. And so if you like this, so like let's say you picked your view, you picked your lighting, you can go here on your view and you can click this little update scene. And so now this is the settings that will be tied to this, okay? And then again, don't forget about your focus. Like if I go here, right, and set focus, I can click here to set my focus and I can really adjust the blur. So like anything that's not in this range will be blurred out. So don't make it, I don't like to go more than 5, okay? And so we basically have this scene, and then let me see if there's anything else on here. Oh, one other thing about the shadow. Let me just update this. Sorry, let me go to the shadow real fast. So when you do custom sun, your sunlight intensity and your sun disk radius are actually important settings. The sunlight intensity is actually going to bump up the highlights. So you see whatever is like lit, right? Whatever is lit already is going to bump up the highlights, right? So I always just keep that as 1 or even a little bit less than 1. So, but just keep it default. The sun disk radius is really interesting. The bigger your sun disk, the more blurred your shadow is going to be and the more soft your shadow is going to be. So if I keep it at 1, the shadow is sharper, right? If you make it 0, you see how sharp the shadow is, right? It's very sharp. It doesn't look good. It looks weird. So if you do 1, it's gonna, kind of blur it. If you punch it a little bit more, it'll make it a little bit softer. If I make it more, look, it's gonna kind of like diffuse it completely. You see? So that kind of softens up your shadow. All right? There's a bunch of other settings on D5. D5 is like packed with settings. But the reason why I like D5 is because of its lighting calculations. It does fantastic lighting calculations, and I actually really like the landscaping textures on here. It has a bunch of amazing other features. And I'm not even like sponsored by them. I'm just saying this. They have a bunch of other amazing features, but I just don't really use them personally. I like to do a lot of my textures like you see here in Rhino. I like to do a lot of these things in Rhino. That's just a personal preference. I like to keep things in my program. I mean, like my primary program that I'm using. And so, again, if I come here, I do the exact same thing, right? I will first test out, whether I want to do a custom sun or not. If I can achieve the results I like, if I can achieve the results I like with the default sun, I'll keep the default sun settings. But if not, then I'm going to do a custom sun setting. And I'll do multiple options and I'll compare, and which is totally fine, you know? So like, for example, if I turn off custom sun, right? And let's say, let's just go, let's play around with this real fast. I'm just, what I'm looking for when I'm doing this, always for any of my renderings, for any of my exterior renderings, right? I am looking for a play of highlights and shadows and making sure the shadows is also touching the architecture so that it feels like everything is combined as one. I don't want things to look like, let me see an example. Like you see this? You see how like nothing is touching the architecture right now? There's no lighting or shadow that's really on the architecture. The architecture is kind of just in like this ambient indirect light, right? Because all the light is kind of coming this way. Like even the architecture is not casting a shadow on anything, right? I don't want that. This feels like a sore thumb. Someone might like this. So someone might like how the polycarbonate looks on here, you know? They might like how the material looks like on here. That's a preference. I personally don't. I like it to be dramatic, and I really like my shadows to be like on the architecture, but in a subtle way, and there's highlights and stuff like that, right? So that's what I'm kind of looking for when I personally do my renderings. So, you know, I'll play around with this at first, you know, so I don't know, let me see. Let me do like 8 a.m. time or something like that. So that's not bad. Like, see, this is nice. I would say this is not bad. Let me see. This is okay, I would say, you know? It's not bad. Like, you know, you have shadows on here, right? And shadows on here, shadows on the ground, but I really want to try to get a shadow like closer to me. That's what I'm looking for, you know? So if I do maybe like a custom sun instead, let's see. Let me play around with. Let me go back to that same one we used for the other one. I think it was like 19 degrees. Oops. 10 degrees is like nighttime. 19 and yeah, see, like this isn't, oh, you want to try to, see, this isn't bad, you know, that's not bad. Where you kind of have the shadow that's coming up like this, the gravel's here, you're getting shadow on here, you have highlights here, you know? So that's, again, the type of lighting I'm trying to get here, okay? And let me just go back and show the polycarb settings again. So the polycarb, I kind of updated 0.94. I gave it a 0.18 thickness, or excuse me, 0.18 roughness. Specular is always 1. And then a thickness of 2.8. Let me go back to V4 just to, okay. Now, when I export these as a rendering, right? When I export these as a rendering, it's really up to you how you want to do your settings, whether it's 2K or 4K. Honestly, if you have a really good computer screen, this is a little silly, but I just want to let you know. Like if your computer, maybe you can't have like a very strong computer, but you have a really great computer screen, you could literally take a screenshot of this. Like I have, like personally, I have a 4K 32-inch screen. So I can take a screenshot of this in like regular view here. Like I can take a screenshot of this. So even if I just go here and I go to view, right? And, or excuse me, window, right? And I uncheck show scene controls, right? And hide all panels and stuff like that. It'll just make this like a complete, it'll make it like a complete, you know, full bleed screen, right? I can take a screenshot of this and it'll be like, you know, almost 200 PPI. Like my screen is 100, my screen's like 190 PPI already at 32 inches, you know, which is massive. So when you downscale it, you're going to have a lot of room to downscale and still have high quality. So that's an option if you don't want to render it, you know. But if you do want to render it, the one really important setting, I mean, pick the aspect ratio you like. Right now, I have this synced with Rhino. So it's picking, right now it's like, you know, almost like a square aspect ratio. But it's really important. I'm trying to find the scroll. Oops. Give me 1 second. Right here. For your channels, you totally want to get some of your material, your IDs here, right? Your channels. Super important to get your material ID. Really, really important to get your material ID. I would also get your sky mask. It's very helpful. And you know, if you have a lot of depth of field, you can get the Z depth and the AO if you want that, you know. But again, I don't like to do a lot of, I don't like to play a lot with my they call these render passes or channels, but like I typically just, the render ID is the most helpful when it comes to photoshopping, okay? And okay, so the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to show you how we can enhance it just a little bit more if you want to. You don't have to. Like, this looks great by itself, and you can use this as final rendering. But if you want to take it to Photoshop, I want to show you just very, very minute and simple enhancements that will really help these renderings. Very small. Honestly, this looks fantastic just straight out of D5. But if you want to push it a little bit more, I just want to show you the things you can do in Photoshop, okay? Okay, so here we are in Photoshop, and I want to show just very simple settings. So like right now, what you're looking at right now is the actual rendering from D5. No other adjustments in Photoshop. This is just straight out of D5. It looks fantastic. It looks great. So if you like how this looks, that's fine. But when I see this, I want it to actually be a little bit warmer. I want it to just be a little bit warmer, right? So I'm going to do a color balance adjustment here, right? A color balance adjustment. So, you know, I'll go down to the, oh, you can't see when I do that, but like, let me minimize this real fast and then just, there you go. Hopefully you can see it. But on the very bottom, you have like the black and white cookie looking icon. But I just want to do, you know, color balance. Okay. And then when I do color balance, for my midtones and for my shadows, I actually want to make them just a little bit warmer. So you see, I'm punching the reds a little bit by +5, punching the magentas here, going to the magentas -5 from the neutral, and then the yellows punching -7 for the midtones. And the same thing for the shadows, okay? I'm +2, so I want the shadows to be warmer. And the same thing, I kept the magenta, I kept the mids here neutral, but the yellows, I want it to be a little bit yellow, okay? So right now you're seeing the before, so let me show you the after when I put it. You see? So that's after, before. After, before. After, before. It's very hard to tell maybe on the computer screen, but I just wanted to have like a warmer red tone to it. That's one adjustment that I'll do. Very simple, very like just minor. It's very minor, but it gives me more control in Photoshop than in the actual software. The next one is the levels, okay? So on your levels, okay, depending where you move these, it's going to either increase or decrease your highlights and your midtones and your shadows, okay? So right now, you know, this is before, right? So before, it looks great in my opinion, but if you just want to have like a slight contrast, a slight punch of the shadows and the highlights, then you definitely want to use yellows, or excuse me, the levels. You can also use the brightness contrast adjustment if you wanted to, or the curves, but levels gives you a lot of control. So you see that's after, before, after, right? It's so nuanced, it's probably so silly. But like, if you see here, right, and like pay attention here, right, and pay attention to the shadows, okay? probably think I'm crazy, but it actually has a difference. It's like a slight contrast, okay? So those are like the two primary adjustments, okay? I want to show you why the render passes are really important. So again, the exact same adjustments here. Exact same adjustments. Let me just show you. Before, after. Before, after. You see it's much more red and warm. Before, after. Okay? Now here. So if you notice here, I'm using the material ID. Okay? This is the material ID. Material ID is helpful because it allows you to select things. So like typically when I'll do like edit, select, let me just, yeah, edit, or excuse me, select color range, right? And you can use the default settings, but if I click here, it's only going to select anything that has this color, and I do okay. So you see, it's only selecting everything with this like cyan color. So then I can like go in here, and let's say, for example, like, you see, let's say it's really dark. I want to only brighten up the architecture. I only want to brighten up the architecture, nothing else. That's why the material ID is so helpful. So then I can click here and go my adjustment layer and go to like brightness contrast. And so now I can brighten up the architecture by itself if I wanted to, which is, this makes no sense. This looks like it's just landed from space, right? But so that's why the render passes are so important. And so again, I'm doing the exact same settings, right? I have, let me just uncheck these. So you see the entire rendering is kind of like bluish. Even after I increase the warmth to like 80,000 on the D5 render, it's still very bluish. I want to go ahead and I did the levels. You see the levels? And then I did the color balance to make it warmer. You see? Before, after. Before, after. And then the architecture, again, I used the material ID to select the architecture, and I brightened it up a little bit, the whole thing. And then I adjusted the levels of the shadows on here. Let me show you. You see? Before, after. So if you look at the adjustments, right? If you look at the adjustments, I made it more bright, right? The highlights are bright, and even the midtones are bright, right? So if you basically look, the range of the midtone, the range of the midtones, right? Or excuse me, the range of the highlights from midtones to highlights is more than the range of the shadows to midtones. So it's more highlight dominant. So I wanted to highlight everything on here, you know? You just drag these, you see? But yeah, that's really about it. And then, you know, you're basically done with how you want these to look. So, you know, that, like, this is the final rendering here, you know, like it looks fantastic. And when you lay it out, it'll look fantastic on a board, you know, on a competition board, or on a studio architecture final review board. You have this nice and big. It'll just look fantastic for even for a client meeting where you're showing them like initial options. This is fantastic. Would I show this? I mean, honestly, I would even show this like even after DD level, because I model this accurately. Like I modeled the size of the material accurately. Even the lighting, even though I was saying earlier it could be embellished, like the actual logistics of the lighting is actually accurate. This is like, you know, sunset lighting basically. So, but then again, if you're really going to exaggerate like the lighting, like you're showing southern hemisphere lighting and you're in northern hemisphere, you know, don't show that to a client, you know, in DD level. That's just basically giving them a false impression. But yeah, like this will look great on a board, an architecture board or architecture competitions. And, you know, I'll cycle through at the end of this to show you some examples of how you can lay this out. But I'm going to do a couple more videos on this for like different types of architecture. This is more like exterior natural environment setting. And again, you know, I'm really focusing on trying to, how you can do this as like quickly as possible. I know this video is pretty long, but like the actual process of doing it doesn't take that long. So I hope you found this helpful. If you did find it helpful, please like and subscribe, because I really want to help this channel grow and trying to spread the word of the channel. But yeah, so keep your eye peeled. I'm gonna upload more videos soon about rendering. Thank you.